Thank you, and good morning, everybody. That was a really fantastic discussion around IARPA. Enjoyed hearing the discussion, the questions, the presentation. This session is really an interesting one for us to talk about how to apply analytics to the increasingly complex nature of threats, physical and cyber threats around the world. I, at IBM, run the Center for the Business of Government, which is a research organization that works with governments here and around the world, producing content, reports, topics, roundtables on key issues facing governments. And of course, this subject that we're talking about today is certainly one of those key issues. Apropos to the topic of the panel, I also serve as the chair of the Department of Homeland Security's Cybersecurity Subcommittee, the advisory committee to the Data Privacy and Integrity Advisory Committee. So I'm very interested in what our panelists will have to say in our discussion this morning. We know that we live in a world where the speed of threats is increasing every day, that the speed of pace that our adversaries are using in establishing those threats is increasing, and that we as a community, both government and industry, must work together to establish vectors to respond using analytics and powerful computing platforms to enable rapid response. We have a tremendous panel to help us work through the issues around this challenging set of problems with us this morning. To my left, we have Brian Doan, the Deputy Chief Technology Officer and Chief Engineer for the Department of Homeland Security's Computer Security and Communications Division, CS&C. And then Jeff Mealy, the Deputy Director for Insider Threat Office with the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, and Matt Olson, who is the President for Business Development with IronNet and formerly the Director of the National Counterterrorism Center. So three tremendous experts in this field. I'd like each of our panelists to just briefly describe your role, what you do, and how it fits into the issue around analytics and response to threat. Brian?
Sure, thank you. So my name is Brian Doan, and I am the Deputy CTO there at the Office of Cybersecurity and Communications. For those of you who are not familiar with the office, because we are within DHS, so sometimes people think we're focused on just the internal cybersecurity there, is that we have responsibilities across the federal, civilian, U.S. government, as well as there with coordination with the critical infrastructure. More especially on information sharing, as well as some aspects of protection. We can go into those details as the dialogue goes forward. What I'm actually very fortunate to do on a daily basis, and it was great that the IARPA director was before us, is to interface with IARPA, DARPA, and QTEL, as well as the DHS Science and Technology, the Silicon Valley Initiative program and activities that are occurring there. So I'm very fortunate to see both where things are today as well as where we have opportunities in the future, including with leveraging data. Thank you.
Like I said, Jeff Mealy, National Geospatial Intelligence Agency. I'm kind of the odd man out here. We run our insider threat program out there. Insider threat over the years has morphed from being typically a espionage detection capability to now we've encompassed everything to include violence in the workplace, suicidal threat, active shooters, etc. So part of the challenge is with us with taking audit data and personnel data and everything else to the extent possible to try to do real-time monitoring to identify a threat or a potential threat before it happens so you can mitigate the action rather than wait until after the action takes place and have to react to it, and sometimes with some severe consequences.
Thanks, Jeff. Matt?
Sure. Good morning, everyone. I'm Matt Olson. I sort of have a before and after. Before was the National Counterterrorism Center, where I was the director there under President Obama from 2011 to 2014. If you had to sum up our mission, it would kind of fit exactly with the title of our panel, which is Advanced Threat Analytics, focused on terrorism. NCTC, as folks many of you may know, is an agency set up after 9/11, and it was really designed to be a central hub for terrorism analytics. It is, according to the statute that created us, the primary organization within the federal government for analyzing threats from international terrorism. The basic challenge of NCTC was to bring together information that was collected by the various operational agencies, CIA, NSA, FBI, and bring it into one place, analyze it, and then share it out with partners at the federal and then state and local as well as internationally. And really to be a clearinghouse for threat intelligence based on one of the fundamental lessons from 9/11 that we really failed to connect information, particularly across the foreign and domestic divide. In other words, CIA and FBI really not sharing information about what we knew about the 9/11, ultimately the 9/11 hijackers. So that's the fundamental mission of NCTC, largely successful, but lots of challenges, I think, the kinds that we're talking about. That's before. After I left government, I co-founded, along with Keith Alexander, the former director of NSA, a cybersecurity company, a technology company, where we're building a network analytics product, basically, again, sort of using big data and advanced computing to identify anomalous activity, behavioral changes on largely commercial, but also government networks to identify cybersecurity threats.
Thanks, Matt. Tremendous expertise across the panel. Let's turn to sort of current events. The President issued a cybersecurity executive order recently. We know that modernizing government technology, the statute by that name is actually before Congress, the Modernizing Government Technology Act. So there are a number of policy and law activities that are changing the nature of how government deals with this threat, and in terms of improving the government's ability to plan for, spend, and respond to threats by modernizing platforms and increasing the ability to share information effectively across agencies. How do you think agencies can leverage the budget and procurement flexibilities that these statutes and executive orders are pointing toward to increase operational speed in working with industry to detect and respond to threats? Brian, you want to start?
Well, I'll touch on a few points and then we can continue the dialogue there too. I think it's a great opportunity for the departments and agencies. One, sometimes people forget that a department agency is independent, and that they are responsible for both their execution of their mission, and especially if they have a role associated with a national essential function, even more important of their activities and execution, but also that they're able to not only leverage their own internal acquisition authorities, but able to partner with other departments and agencies and see what can occur there. As an example, with DHS, many people did not realize that in the Homeland Security Act that it gave us the opportunity to utilize other transaction authorities. And that's a key focus of the Silicon Valley Initiative program, which is phenomenal, to where it starts there, and then if something can't be covered, then you go to other acquisition, procedures or pursuit. But I guess one thing that I see over and over again is where people believe that they already have to have the magic vehicle in place to be able to execute. And also where we have the outside expertise inside of the corporations where they're waiting on government to identify their exact needs, including exactly how that's going to be performed, in what period of time, and exactly how much that's going to cost. And I don't understand that. It doesn't seem to make sense to me. I think we do need better opportunities for bidirectional communications. That's one thing that's great about things like other transactional authorities, the flexibility that IARPA, DARPA, and QTEL have. But I think it's one of the things people get away from is those organizations are very good at doing risk management. We're here to talk about cybersecurity risk management, but those organizations are experts in doing risk management and saying, what is my risk to move forward for this subject area? If there really is this type of gain, and it meets this type of mission need, what am I willing to put out there, including if it's a failure, but by default is that one of your things is to capture lessons learned, so you're never a failure. They're experts in that. I think that's something that can be brought over to cyber. And the one that, maybe the last thing is linkage. If you look at the executive order, it helps the department agency head further understand that it is their responsibility associated with cybersecurity. What's nice about that is if you look in any of the large departments and agencies, it's usually the deputy director, so it depends on the title, of course, of the department and agency. So let's say deputy secretary within DHS is really the chief operating officer and is the one responsible through things like the deputies committees, through the National Security Council, with now the responsibility across any cybersecurity subject, including things like ransomware or other things that might have come up recently. If you're enabling that person who's now responsible for every, as we refer to it, level 1 programs, so $1 billion plus programs, that they're responsible for cybersecurity, it's a game changer. So I think, the cybersecurity executive order, as well as some other things getting in place right now, is just allowing the department agency heads and the people supporting them to be able to move forward and execute.
Thanks, Brian. Matt, you've been on both sides of the aisle. Your thoughts on incentives on both sides?
Yeah, I really agree with Brian, a lot of your points. I mean, having been in the terrorism side, where the authorities have been well established in terms of collecting information. They're really, the federal government primarily responsible, along with state and local governments to a certain degree, collecting information relevant to the cybersecurity threats. The terrorism threats, and then sharing that information. What you see, I think, is when you get to the cybersecurity side, is a much higher degree of challenge in the fundamental problem of sharing information that's largely collected in the private sector. So the vast majority of our critical infrastructure is run by the private sector. They're seeing the threats every day. How does that information get into the federal government side? I think the prior legislation from 2015 on cybersecurity sharing, the role of DHS is critical. The new executive order, I think, helps to emphasize that private-public partnership more, and mandating further studies to be done. But I still think there's a fundamental challenge in getting the federal government information that it can use to help mitigate threats when those threats are arising largely in the private sector, and then conversely, having the public sector, the government, particularly NSA, FBI, DHS, who are seeing some of this classified information, figure out how to share that information at speed, where it can be used with those that are largely victimized in the private sector. So that's one key point, just terrorism to cyber. I think the procurement side, I think it remains a real challenge. I think Jason's fantastic, and the work that IARPA and DARPA are doing in terms of research is great. DIUX I would throw in the mix too, in terms of facilitating some of the ways that the federal government can procure the latest technology. But I still think that and this is a common refrain among groups like this is really still a challenge. Yeah. And I see it now from the IronNet cybersecurity side, where we have a much easier way of dealing with big banks and energy companies as commercial customers relative to the federal government. Still, it's a lengthy and at times tedious process that is really a disincentive to being able to work with the federal government.
Thanks, Matt. Jeff, any lessons from the intelligence community perspective that you work with for this issue?
Yeah, well, just to start out, it's a wow thing, right? This executive order mandates a lot of stuff. Keep your systems current. Get rid of legacy stuff that's outdated. Make sure you're supporting stuff. From the government perspective, it's a challenge for us to even just identify a platform we want to use and go through the acquisition process. By the time I identify it to the time I get it to the door, it could be 90 days to 6 months at a good shot. And then if I want to get it accredited, that might be another 6 months to a year, because if it's a new type system, having to get it through the CIO and all those other processes. I think part of where we're broke down with speed is we don't, the government hasn't been real good about building security in depth into the systems as they're delivered. And that's something that we're working on at the IC level right now, which is actually, if anybody's familiar with ICD 503 or the NIST 853, which are the security controls that the CIOs use to give a system an ATO. When that was originally built, there's over 600 controls in that. Privacy came in, they put a privacy overlay and said, in order to protect privacy of the workforce, you have to do these things. We're working on now an insider threat overlay that says there's 420 controls in there that address insider threat concerns. If you're going to accredit a system, these have to be collected, these have to be provided to either insider threat or security or CI for analysis. So we don't have to go ask some other MAI to get the information, because that's part of the fight right now. But these two documents are going to force, it's a good thing, it's going to be a challenge. It's going to be a hard challenge to get 17 agencies to agree on the same way to do something it's like asking 2 different lawyers to agree on, can you do, is this proper or not?
Much less 17.
And no lawyers in the room, are there?
Right.
So thinking about current threat facing the globe, obviously ransomware in various different forms facing many nations, what are the threats, the actions that government can take to think about using analytics to understand what the future threats might be and how to detect and respond to them in real time?
Sure. So with the current activities, I've seen multiple groups of people focus on multiple dimensions of the subject area. One group, of course, says this is ransomware and now we have to completely focus on ransomware. I think we've all seen that. I would kind of go back to, it seems like that's an intention of an individual, is that they're utilizing technology, they're utilizing capabilities, including capabilities which, have to be on for key necessary services or, high value assets, as, terminology within the U.S. government. And if we go back to the data and allow people to really be exploratory analysts, not that they've gone through the training to be the experts in exploratory analysis, because I know we have some data scientists out here too, and they're amazing in generalists, but also just allow cybersecurity professionals to go back to the data. What did the data state? What did it show? What was it showing in terms of the tactics, techniques, and other methods that these people are doing? A simple example would be if somebody's sending an email, including from one IP address to 1,000 people within a department and agency, might be something you're interested in. It might have just been, your invitation to this event. That's okay. That's not a bad thing. But yet it could be something else. And I guess where I get fearful of is where somebody completely just focuses on one topic area or the intent, or even some meetings that are occurring downtown today in DC, which I was fortunate to get out of, associated with focus just on the threat. Or they go, if we just focus on the threat, then we're good to go. And I go, all right, even if we're doing basic risk management, that doesn't make sense in any way. But there's people who believe if I just focus on one subject area, then it will tell me everything else. And I just say, allow people to go back to the data. What has this shown and what's the other thing shown? And maybe a last part to bring up is if you think of, some people are familiar with the document ABC for botnet remediation. And of course, it's leveraging things that were done across the globe, especially from countries such as Australia and Japan and others, who understood that they had a significant botnet issue, and then there was many reasons why people would leverage botnets, including for ransomware or denial of service or other reasons. But there's ways that we could provide better protection. There's also ways that you can provide better detection. And I think, working with the private sector, with people who already have the data, as well as they have the capabilities in place that could, shape the traffic or otherwise change things, we have a much broader discussion.
Jeff, in terms of insider threats and the use of analytics to understand, detect, and respond, thoughts on this?
Yeah, just because the attack comes from the outside, just use OPM for an example. I mean, how long was the bad guy inside the system sitting and waiting before they actually did the data exfiltration? So do we think of it as an external attack? Do we think of it as an internal attack? Or do we think of it as a combination of both? I mean, if I were a bad guy, I wouldn't just come at you from the outside. I'd also have somebody on the inside planting stuff, sitting, waiting. And many times we'll see things where the security operations centers, your CSOCs will sit there, they start getting a denial of service attack. So where's all their focus attention? Of course, where it needs to be, how do we stop this, shut it down? But then your attention isn't diverted to, did I have somebody on the inside who's been storing stuff up and is stuff just sneaking out the back door while I'm focused over here doing these types of things? I think what we got to get better at is one, and this comes down into artificial intelligence and being able to do anomaly detection. What doesn't look right on the system? Is it automated? Is it man-made? Is it person-generated? And is this something that we should be doing something about, and how do we go about it? Do we sit and wait and watch and try to figure it out? Do we stop it? Lots of times we'll step in and stop something prematurely before we can figure out the TTPs to it. So you shut it down so they just figure out another way to do it and send it back in, and now you got to go back to ground zero and figure it all out again. So between CSOC and insider threat, we're starting to actually talk about merging the two capabilities and putting people in each other's centers so we can actually learn from each other. We do everything on the employee basis, and they do the stuff on the system, and then start tying those together to get a better 360 view on what's happening across your systems.
That's interesting. Actually, our DHS subcommittee that I mentioned came out with a report around privacy protection and anomaly detection regimes last year. That was something to talk to DHS about, but also other agencies. So a lot of issues involved there. Matt, how did the Counterterrorism Center view this use of analytics and sort of understanding what's over the horizon?
It's a great question. I think to me, in my time at NCTC, sort of 2011 to 2014, it was a real focus of ours, because we had spent the first 10 years or so, 6 years, 7 years, I guess, of our existence really focusing on gathering information, breaking down legal, policy, cultural, bureaucratic barriers to sharing, right? That was the first step, was to convince CIA to trust us with the information, convince FBI to trust us, share lots of U.S. person information with the center. So we had, and DHS as well, we got a lot of travel data from DHS. So that took a lot of work, more work than you might think at first blush. But what I encountered was that we had all this information, had access to it, but we really didn't have the ability to analyze it quickly and make it meaningful to the analysts at NCTC. So as an example, after the Boston bombing at the Boston Marathon, which was 2013, April of 2013, I think. We had a lot of information. There was a lot of information about the Tsarnaev brothers, if you remember, but that information was not really at the fingertips of analysts in the way it needed to be. So I set up a data innovation office because really a lot of that work was being done in our IT department, which kept our systems going, critical part of our organization, but really wasn't, to your point, Dan, looking over the horizon at figuring out what's happening really in other parts of the government, in the private sector, to really leverage all the data that we have access to. Because really, the fundamental insight, and we're seeing this now again with the Manchester bombing last week, is that when these events occur, it's almost always the case that these individuals are on the radar in some way. There is some place where there's information about them. I resist the idea that we missed something or that there was an intelligence failure. I think it's just the challenge of understanding when we do have access to some information, some insight, some bit of intelligence, that we're making the best possible use of it by leveraging all of the advances that are taking place in terms of advanced computing and big data analytics.
Is that Data Innovation Office still
Yes.
a going concern?
Yes.
And how do you interact with industry? How does that office?
So it's got it actually does work with IBM and other important companies, some not as big as IBM, and we really work a lot with Jason at IARPA to make sure that we have insights into what's being developed. We largely also follow what CIA is doing in the same vein to make sure that we're linked in with their work to stay on top of the latest trends. I mean, it's trite but true that the government just tends to lag behind a little bit when it comes to, I think, to being able to take advantage of the advances that are occurring in the private sector.
So taking information in from government, from industry, acting as a collective hub of the use of analytics to look forward.
Exactly.
Really interesting function. Let's get a little bit specific. In your work, you deal with incidents all the time. Can you think of a specific case, appropriately described, where analytics help you to understand a threat, respond to a threat, share information, etc.? Some sort of a lesson learned from a case.
Well, I don't deal with cases. I have to be specific there. And actually it brings an opportunity for me to bring up is we've been able to now partner across government to have the right players at the table, including from the law enforcement side and from people dealing with incidents. And sometimes does something even reach the level of incident, or are people spending a lot of time trying to figure out, does it reach the level of incident? But I guess where I see the most value is when data is flipped. You just flip the data and you say, okay, here's what's known, but here's what's not known. One example that I've seen as being very, very effective over and over again across enterprises, especially with understanding, do you have equipment on your enterprise which either is untrusted in some way or at least something to further look at, is just look at all the MAC addresses within your enterprise. Do you have any repeats? There could be a reason why that occurred, especially if one company bought another company. The smaller company lacked practices associated with how they distribute MAC addresses across all their devices. But even just flipping the data and looking at that provides some insight. One of the things that I saw as a huge change for our executives was, if you implement a signature, both one that's either detecting or one that's preventing, which both have impact, then to flip the data there too is to see, has somebody changed their behavior based upon that signature being in place. And it can change whether it's detective or preventative. I think maybe one last thing on this is to go back to even your role with DHS associated with some of the privacy activities. You've reviewed things like network behavior, analysis, anomaly detection, and what you did is you went back to the fundamentals of if you're doing this for cybersecurity protection and defense, then you can do it in this manner. You can utilize this type of data. So I think that provides us the opportunity to say, okay, look at that type of data. These are the data elements that you can look at. You can look at NetFlow. You can look at this. And what I challenge really the industry to say is, don't wait on the government to describe what you can do. What are you all doing whenever you combine those data sets, both for your own companies, as well as whenever you're bragging about what you've been able to do with the, whatever stock exchange of the day, no matter if it's local or overseas, is how were you able to do that, and what were your data dependencies? And I oftentimes find that vendors over and over again will say, well, just tell us what you want or what you need. And I go, we're telling you through our publishing of a privacy impact assessment and otherwise what we could already do without asking additional questions. Help us understand now what we could do with that data.
Thanks. Other thoughts on specific incidents, lessons learned?
Yeah, I can give you a case. When we do insider threat analysis, we don't use any one specific software tool. We use a suite of tools that complement each other. We had, probably about a year and a half ago, we had an instance where one of our employees, we caught up on some email, hit a priority 5 trigger. It came up in of course, insider threat, like I said, the definition is expanded. We're now violence in the workplace, threat to others, threat to self. And we picked up on some suicidal indicators on this person. Of course, then you flip over and you go and you do your badging records and say, well, is the person into work? Well, the person wasn't into work that day. This had come in from an outside email chain. So we were a little bit concerned about it. Taking what we had, we did our initial analytics. We gave it to our threat mitigation unit, and we ended up calling local police and said, hey, can you guys, we're a little concerned this person's not into work. Supposed to be here today. Can you guys run by and do a health and welfare check for us? They did. They got in contact with the person. They talked to them. The person was exhibiting suicidal tendencies and ideology. So they asked him, first of all, do you have a weapon in the house? The person said, yep. They said, are you willing to surrender the weapon? The person surrendered the weapon and said, you really need to go get some help. So the person ended up self-admitting to the hospital. Now, we like to chalk that up as a win, right? We were able to identify something before it happened, interject. The person may not have ever gone through with the threat. We don't know. But this is where what we're talking about is to be able to take all that data. When I first started this about 8 years ago in NGA, I was a one-man shop, and we might have gotten, megabytes of data a week in user activity monitoring. We're pulling in terabytes a week now, and even with the increase in personnel, we're only able to get to about 0.5% of that data. So you got to be able to triage it, detect what's a true anomaly versus a false flag, and get to these things. I'm not saying that we don't have, everybody's got quirky people, right? And there's a lot of false positives. Even if it looks like it's a good hit, you end up going and talking to them, well, I was just joking around or didn't really mean it. But to be able to sort through that stuff in a timely, almost near real-time fashion is a tough haul. And it's something we have to leverage the new technologies and everything that's out there to be able to get there, because everything is going bigger, better, faster, and technology outpaces our ability to catch up. Always.
Powerful example. Matt?
Yeah, a couple quick examples. So one on the terrorism side, and this was a few years ago, but it was a big data solution that made us better and more efficient, and that was the ability to run information that came to us about people trying to come into the country, visa applicants, as well as people coming here from Europe under the visa waiver program, against the terrorism watch list. And that had been at times had been a ponderous process that was not as precise, and really working with the private sector developed a solution that made that process extremely efficient, lowered the false positive rate, and made it so that we could quickly identify individuals who are trying to come here, come to the country non-U.S. citizens and identify them whether they were on the terrorism watch list, which NCTC largely maintained. So that was a really good news story, sort of a win-win, better and more efficient process. So that's a general example. A more specific example on the cybersecurity side and this is a problem. I mean, you touched on this a little bit, Brian, of when you get beyond signatures, when you're looking at cybersecurity threats and you're looking for behaviors, one of the types of behaviors that you often see, which adversaries use, particularly advanced adversaries, is beaconing out from a network, right? To establish a command and control relationship with the bad guy. But the problem is that most networks are beaconing all the time, and almost all of them are completely innocent. And what the adversary will do is to establish what appears to be a random beacon in order to evade detection of those that have a set pattern that might be easier to discern. So what we've developed is basically an algorithm to detect pseudo-random beaconing. What is designed to look random, but indeed is not random, it's pseudo-random. And we've used that ability to identify some adversaries in some of our customers who are seeking to really slowly establish that command and control node and their advanced threats. And that is you could only do that with really advanced analytics and being able to leverage large amounts of data, really right down to the packet level. So network flow data to look for what appears to be random, but in fact is not random beaconing of the type that is in fact malicious.
Really interesting.
And I think, so one example there that I've seen really smart, just combining two data sets, is when was the domain registered, and do you have somebody on your network beaconing to it? Was it registered yesterday?
Right.
And now you have somebody on your network magically going to it. It's not, standard HTML. It's nothing, something's unusual and looking into it. And I was really excited and really impressed with the department agency recently who said, all we know is that we have a lot more DNS traffic. They said, we don't know anything more than that, and we really just need help. They knew that they didn't understand, number one, and they knew they needed help. And I just go, that's fantastic, because then they're able to find what's actually going on. But I think it comes down to knowing what's actually occurring. Mm-hmm. And if we prevent that, then that's not a good thing.
Yeah, advanced analytics, cognitive computing, artificial intelligence, all the issues that we're talking about here today at the conference help both in terms of understanding the threat, responding, but we know that we live in a world where risk will continue to be part of our daily life as individuals, as businesses, as government agencies. In that environment, how do we think about using these analytics as a resilience factor in terms of we know the threats are there, we know that we'll be able to stop 1,000, one may get through. Agencies, industry working together need to be resilient. How do you see resilience as a goal and objective, and how does advanced analytics assist with that?
So I think it's a great question. Personally, I was excited to attend the recent MITRE-led activity, and it was, on behalf of NIST, that they led the activity of dealing with cybersecurity resilience. And one of the things that I didn't realize is that they try to include a resilience appendix within NIST 853. And it's still something that you can go out there and get. And, is it perfected in any way? No. But what it does is it starts to get across is what does it even mean to have cybersecurity resilience? Start to define even the terms. And I think that's really exciting. And maybe just to touch on one thing around that, I'm scared at times with AI whenever I see people just rely on the machines only. I think it's great to see what machines can do and just let them run on their own, and that's fantastic, but I kind of view that as if you're a parent and you go, okay, this is my child, but I'm just hoping they're going to learn on their own. That's ridiculous. But I see that over and over again, including at times when I've been in meetings where I look over the person next to me who is an expert on specific countries, an absolute expert, including anything that needs to be done. And they're just relying on a computer and saying that it's AI. And I go, no, that's not in any way what you need to do. The other side is they don't realize the information that they've learned, and then utilizing even standard things such as IDS, IPS, etc., now to leverage those indicators and understanding.
Certainly we see these technologies as helping people make better decisions, augmenting human decision making. And that your point is very well taken. Other thoughts?
Surfacing the anomaly detection, I think, is where the AI comes in. It's still, like you said, it still takes an analyst. I see a lot of challenge with just look at the NITTF standards, minimum standards for insider threat perspective. We now have 12,000 clear defense contract agencies out there that now have to bring this up. And when they start doing that, if you're a bad guy, you're going to go after the weakest link in the chain. Once that's detected, the ability to share that across, and I think that's part of our challenge here, is how do we get the information in and get it back out to the people that need it, so that everybody's looking for that signature to potentially stop a mass attack. If you go in the weakest, if you go into an unprotected system, you can work your way through all the way up to classified systems if you know what you're doing. That's going to be a challenge. It's just not an easy thing to do. Of course, none of what we do is easy. If it was easy, it had already been done, and most of us would probably be out of a job. So I think that's kind of the biggest challenge to building resiliency into the program, is not just being able to, for big agencies to do it, but being able to share it back out so that everybody's aware in as near real time as possible, so I don't just protect myself.
Matt, you've seen risk and resilience strategies in government and industry. Are there lessons that each sector can teach with the other?
Well, you know, on the terrorism side, when I was in government, you know, we talked a lot about resilience, and I would say, you know, and really DHS leading the way in terms of sort of resilience in the aftermath of a terrorist attack. And I think, you know, my thought there is just that we've done a really good job in terms of how the population, or the U.S. citizens respond. I think politically we have a ways to go in terms of resilience, sort of not overreacting. So I think that's kind of a divide I, in my own mind, draw on the terrorism side. On the cybersecurity side, you know, I think the reality is that, you know, companies are going to be breached. That's why this is such an important topic, is resilience, and you know, how they respond is going to determine the degree to which they really incur significant loss. One lesson I've seen is that, and this, I think you guys both made this point, is that as much as we like to rely on machines to help us surface threats and understand the nature of what we're facing in the commercial sector, the reality is that we still are going to have a person making a decision in terms of mitigation. We're not seeing automated mitigation yet from companies. They still want to be the one to decide. They want someone deciding, am I going to turn off that port? Am I going to, you know, unplug that machine? And that's still a person making that decision, because there are business and operational implications to that decision.
So final question, we have leaders from across the government here, experts from government and industry. If you were to think of sort of a takeaway that they could take into the panel sessions the rest of the morning and the afternoon for thought in terms of the use of analytics to understand threats, both current and evolving, what's one or two lessons that you would leave our audience with?
One thing I'd bring up for consideration is that if we think about risk management, we think about this resilient subject area, how do you enable that? It's not through just one process or one technique, but also through looking at the data of every output as an input. If we now have the compute capability that we can do more, and we expect that of our analysts, is that great? So now you have this output, how's it going to be used by others, and as well as yourselves, with better understanding this problem area, but also allowing for resilience. And I think the OpenC2 work, maybe people are already familiar with that, of how could we standardize the actions which can be taken by devices, which is going into OASIS right now. I think that's an example, is there was smart people who took a parallel path and said, we at least need to be able to talk to any router, switch, firewall that's key, and just be able to take immediate action when it's appropriate, you know, even if it's automated or not automated, let's at least allow for the opportunity. Thanks.
Jeff, final thought?
Keep an open mind. You know, we identify a problem set, we set our mind on how we're going to come up with a solution for it, and then lots of times we put barriers up and we go down a certain path, and we ignore things that are to the left or right of us that might actually augment or be a better way of doing business. As senior leaders, I think it's our job to make sure we keep an open mind as we go, so if we need to adjust en route, we make the adjustments before it's too late. We spend a lot of money chasing things, sometimes the best things in sliced bread, and then we get it in there and it doesn't do everything we wanted it to do without this other piece added to it. So keep an open mind, other ideas.
Matt?
Yeah, I think a key lesson going forward and challenge for everyone here is just how to take these issues of threat analytics and make it an issue that is a question, a challenge for your senior leaders, right? The CEOs or directors or secretaries and assistant secretaries, deputy secretaries of your agencies and leaders of your companies, because these are not problems that should be simply a technology problem or a security problem or an IT problem. These are risk management problems for companies and for the government. And making it a risk management, this is fundamental to the mission of our company or organization. It's not just something for the technologists to solve or the security professionals to solve. Making that transition to this is about the fundamental mission, I think is an important an important transition to make, and it really is important when it comes to cybersecurity.
Well, phenomenal insights from our panel. Thank you so much. Please join me in.